Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce William A. Galston, who holds the Ezra Zika Chair at the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies Program, where he serves as a senior fellow. He is also College Park Professor at the University of Maryland. Prior to January 2006, he was Saul Stern Professor at the School of Public Policy, University of Maryland, Director of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy, and Founding Director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. From 1993 to 95, he served as Deputy Assistant to President Clinton for Domestic Policy. Dr. Galston is the author of 8 books and more than 100 articles in the fields of political theory, public policy, and American politics. His most recent books are Liberal Pluralism, The Practice of Liberal Pluralism, and Public Matters. A winner of the American Political Science Association's Hubert H. Humphrey Award, he was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2004, and I just learned he's a former Marine. So thank you for being here. in friendly climate, thank you for coming.
Well, no, you may not guess it to look at me, but I was actually a sergeant in the Vietnam era. That was an interesting interlude between graduate school and the beginning of my professional career. I don't intend to rattle on for a long time. I've learned as I've gotten older that I don't learn much when I listen to myself talk. And I learn a lot more, and I suspect you will too, in the discussion. But I do want to lay out a few preliminary thoughts, and let me make those thoughts as clear as possible right at the beginning. As I look around the world, I can't think of anybody, any country, I would happily trade places with. And I'm not just talking about the American way of life. I'm talking about the assets that we continue to command and can bring to bear on challenges at home and abroad. If we have problems, and we certainly do, and I'll talk about them, those problems are principally internal, not external. If things go badly in the next generation, we have only ourselves to blame. That's my overall message, and now let me be specific. Before I start wringing my hands about the challenges we face, let's review the bidding. Let's take a look at the assets that we bring to the international and domestic challenges of the next generation. And I'm going to begin in a very classical way with geography. I'm not going to go on for a long time about this, but I suspect that when countries around the world hear our raucous arguments about securing our borders, they must smile grimly in envy. Where else in the world does a country enjoy so many thousands of miles of essentially undefended borders? Undefended because they really don't have to be defended very much. An enormous advantage. Second, demography. As you look around the world, you see rapidly aging populations almost everywhere, with the exception of the Middle East and North Africa, which is having an enormous youth bulge. But everywhere else around the world, you are seeing societies wrestling with the challenges of rapidly aging populations. Now, our population is aging too. Don't misunderstand me. But there is a kind of flow at the bottom through immigration because of the attractiveness of our institutions and the opportunities that we offer, which gives us, looking forward generations, a substantially better demographic profile than you see in Europe or in the large nations of East Asia. And we will have, it seems to me, a continuing infusion of demographic dynamism. Third, obviously, is natural resources. I don't want to go on and on about this, but whether you look at our agricultural resources or our energy resources, we'd be nuts to trade places with anyone. And as everybody knows, technological developments in the energy field in the past 5 or 10 years have transformed the domestic and global picture, and we are looking forward to much brighter prospects on the energy front than we might have imagined. We've spent decades wringing our hands and talking about our dependence on hostile external sources, and we are on track to substantially diminishing that independence and gaining not only diplomatic but also economic advantages from that diminution. Fourth asset are institutions. I've spent the past 7 years studying how badly they function. I don't take any of that back, but if you look at our judicial system, if you look at our regulatory system, and if you look at the level of corruption in the functioning of our official institutions, we are doing very, very well by world standards. We have lots of rooms for improvement on the institutional front. That's what I do for a living, and I can talk about that all day, but I don't have all day to talk about it. But suffice it to say that our institutions give us a substantial advantage, not over everybody, but over lots of people. Fifth asset, our system of higher education. Right? It gives us an extraordinary research capacity. And it's not just bricks and mortar. It's a tradition, a way of doing business in higher education and research that nations around the world are scrambling to emulate. And sixth and finally, the spirit of the people. There are reasons for concern about the erosion of some of our traditions, and I know for a fact that you'll be hearing a little bit more about that. But at the same time, the American people retain a spirit of innovation that I think provides, the wind is in our sails because the spirit of innovation is blowing into those sails, and we're going to have to work very hard to repress it. We're going through a rough patch now, but I really don't expect that rough patch to last. Okay, I could go on, but that is a sketchy inventory of the very considerable assets that we bring to the challenges at home and abroad. And now let me turn a little bit less sanguine and talk for a few minutes about what I see to be the principal challenges that we face. And in keeping with my headline paragraph, I'm not going to be talking about the Chinese. We can talk about that if you want. I'm going to be talking about us, because I think that our principal challenges are internal rather than external. And if we get our own house in order, we can look forward to a very bright 21st century. So, and I'm going to talk about 3 categories of challenges that we face. And let me list them before I tick them off and talk about them one at a time. First of all, social divisions. Secondly, the way we allocate public resources. And third, our national will and confidence. So let me talk about social divisions first. First, a caveat. In a free society, differences and divisions are inevitable. If you don't believe me, just read Federalist Paper number 10, where James Madison memorably, and I think correctly for all time, makes the point that the air of liberty is the fuel of difference and division. People have different preferences, different thoughts, different skills and aptitudes, and those in a free society will inevitably turn into differences, some of which are individual, some of which are group or even collective. And so the idea that a free society can be a Confucian harmonious society, it's a contradiction in terms. It can't be. And a free society can never have the kind of unity and chain of command that a military establishment does. It just doesn't work that way. And in the same way that you can't take what you learn as a business CEO and bring it into democratic politics, nor can you simply take what you learn as a military leader and bring it into democratic politics, because the organization and the basic principle of organization is fundamentally different. Having said that, we are suffering from what I will call surplus divisions at the present moment. And let me just list a few of them. First of all, I have to mention economic inequality. It is at the highest level measured since 1929. And it's getting worse, not better. Since 2009, the bottom of the recession and the beginning of the official recovery, the wealth of the top 7% in our society, according to an authoritative study released just yesterday, has risen by 30 cents. 30% rather. No, 30 cents, right. 30%. The wealth of the bottom 93% has actually declined by 4% during that period. So 100% plus of the wealth gains since the bottom of the recession have gone to the very top tier of American society. Now, I could explain why, it would make perfect sense, but this is a problem because it's a problem that's being repeated on the income front. Almost all of the income gains since the bottom of the recession have gone to the very top. And indeed, if you look at the income of the households right in the middle, what the econometricians call the median household, that income is down by 7% since 2007. So your average American household is trying to make do with 93 cents on the dollar. And there hasn't been, and there hasn't been a lot of inflation since then, but there's been inflation in a lot of key areas like healthcare and higher education and gasoline, things that people in middle-class households notice. So that's the first kind of division that we have to pay attention to. Economic equality, economic inequality, which in my judgment has reached a level where it poses a challenge to the unity and cohesion of American society. I'm not one of those people who just looks at a table of figures and says, oh, this is terrible. You have to try to look at what the numbers mean for social cohesion, a sense that we're all in it together. And it is very difficult to maintain the sense that we're all in it together when we live such very different lives. Not only the bottom, but even there are huge and increasing differences between the way people in the middle live and the way people at the top live. It's a problem. We have to think about it. We have to figure out some way of ameliorating it. Second, and here I'm going to poach on Charles Murray's territory for just a minute, there has been the development of what I will call family inequality during the past generation. And this is a big deal because we can talk about civic education in our public schools and the Naval Academy all we want. But the crucial institution for the formation of children, as everybody knows, is the family. And the family is not in great shape right now, but the shape that it's in looks very, very different depending on where you're looking in society. Let me just pull one thread of a complex tapestry here. And that is out-of-wedlock births. So if you ask the question across the country as a whole, what are the trends in first births to women outside of marriage? 40 years ago, about 25% of first births to women were outside of wedlock, sometimes prior to wedlock and sometimes as a replacement for it, permanent replacement. If you run that reel forward 40 years to the year 2010, you find that that figure is about doubled to 50%, 47% to be precise. So across the society, there has been a profound change in the relationship between childbearing and child rearing. But the picture looks very different when you break it down. Let me just give you one very simple breakdown. If you have a college education, the odds are overwhelming that you're living in a traditional family. That is family where people get married and they have children after they get married. Only 12% of children born to college-educated women are born outside of wedlock. Now let's look at the rest of society. Let's take the middle tier, people who've gotten out of high school and may even have some college. And you ask the same question, what percentage born out of wedlock? 58%. 58%. Then suppose you go all the way to the bottom of society and ask the same question. Answer, 83%. So those are the figures I'd like you to keep in mind. 12%, 58%, 83%. That's what I mean by the development of family inequality, and this is very much a development of the past two generations. If you'd looked at the same tableau 40 years ago, not only would the overall figures have been very much lower, as I said, but the gap between the top and the bottom was only about a third of its size right now. So family inequality. And the third kind of social division, and I've spent the past year studying this, is the polarization of our political system, particularly but not only at the national level. Suffice it to say that at no time since the 1890s, that's not the 1990s, that's the 1890s, has the division between the two political parties been as sharp and stark as it is right now. Political scientists have ways of measuring this, and it was literally the case that at the end of the 112th Congress in the Senate of the United States, the most conservative Democratic senator was a little bit more liberal than the most liberal Republican senator. So if you drew the two ideological bell curves of the two political parties, there was no overlap, no point of tangency. That is about the starkest illustration of polarization that I can give. And it expresses itself operationally. If you ask, for example, how frequently are members of the opposition party supporting legislation that the president favors? In the 1960s, a standard figure was about 50%. If you looked at the Johnson administration or even the Nixon administration, during the Johnson administration, Republicans favored about 50% of the legislation the Johnson administration was pushing on average. In the Nixon administration, Democrats went along with about 50% of what Nixon was proposing. That was then. This is now. I think I don't have to tell you how much lower the propensity is of the opposition party to support the incumbent president's proposals. And this is not a partisan statement because Democrats were no more likely to support George W. Bush than Republicans are to support Barack Obama. And then finally, if you adopt the metric of major legislation, you would expect, if there are big differences between the political parties, that they would manifest themselves in the highest profile legislation, the stuff that really changes a society. Well, again, there's been a huge change. If you look back to the big game changers of the 1960s, things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and Medicare, they all passed with huge bipartisan majorities. Or take something that you probably know about and care about, the War Powers Act of the early 1970s. Not only did it have large bipartisan majorities, but it was actually repassed over Richard Nixon's veto. That's how big the majorities were. If you look at the Social Security reforms of the 1980s, you'll see the same thing, big bipartisan majorities. And then in the past 20 years, things have changed. Bill Clinton's first budget, the administration that I was part of, squeaked through with not a single Republican vote in support in either the House or the Senate, and a lot of arm twisting to get that 50th Democratic senator supported, I can tell you that. And if you look at the canonical example of polarization, the Affordable Care Act, Barack Obama's health reform, that speaks for itself. So there you have our social divisions, economically, in the family, and certainly politically. Second, and here I may go over some ground that Dave Walker went over in his remarks, the allocation of resources. Now, I'm not going to talk about the deficit and the debt. I've been working on those questions for years. I'm a member of a clandestine bipartisan conspiracy in Washington that's really trying to forge some consensus on addressing the problem. I won't go into that. I'm sure Dave Walker did in spades. He and I talk very frequently, and I think I know what he thinks about these things. The point that I want to make is this. Step back from the details of the federal budget and ask the following question. As between, or among, should I say, the past, the present, and the future, what are we doing with the vast national resources at our disposal? And the single simple point I want to make is that we're spending more and more of our national resources on the past and the present and less on the future. That is not good news for the future, to put it mildly. And let me just dramatize this with a very simple statistic. Discretionary spending, the category of discretionary spending, as you know, funds not only the U.S. military and major investments in the U.S. military, but also all of the domestic programs, including the domestic programs that fund things like education, basic research, the national institutes, which are, one of the crown jewels, it seems to me, of the American research community. So let's just take a look at that. What are we on track to do for the future over the next 10 years? And you can go to supplemental table S9 of the President's budget if you don't believe what I'm about to say, even though it is quite unbelievable intrinsically. In 2013, if you just look at the basic national security, the basic defense budget, we spent about 4% of our GDP on defense. Not as high as it's been in some periods, but about a percentage point above where it's been at the very low points. Over the next 10 years, we are on track to see that figure go down by 40% as a share of gross domestic product, from 4.0 to 2.4%. Well, you might say Barack Obama is a Democrat. He likes to end wars, not start them. Maybe his heart isn't really in the military, so surely discretionary domestic spending must be doing better. Nope. Right now, we're spending about 3.7% of our GDP, all told, on discretionary domestic spending, which includes all of the education, all of the research, all of the health, all of the health institutes, all of the job training, et cetera, all of the infrastructure, everything that we think about when we talk about public investments in the future. Over the next 10 years, that is scheduled to decline from 3.7 to 2.5% of gross domestic product, about a third as a share of our total national product. How can we defend the country adequately and invest in the future adequately on that trajectory? My answer is very simple. We can't. This is not a viable future for our country. Why are we on that track? Very simple. Over the next 10 years, we'll spend more and more on programs for retirees and more on interest on the national debt. The story is as simple as that. This is not the track we want to be on as a country. At least it's not the track I want to be on, and I suspect very strongly that there isn't a person in this room who on sober reflection would say, yeah, that's just fine, because it's not. Okay, so that's the second problem, how we allocate our resources internally. And the third problem has to do with the what John Maynard Keynes, I guess, would call the animal spirits of the American people. You know, right now they're at very low ebb, whether we're talking about a shortage of testosterone or estrogen or some combination of the two or something else. It's at a very low ebb. And what are the empirical indicators of that? Well, trust in government, but not only government, our major institutions, is way down. In many cases, it's at or near historic lows. The connective tissue that binds the people to their government has frayed very, very badly. Second, confidence in the future. If you ask Americans, how confident are you that your children will live better lives than you have? The number willing to answer that question in the affirmative is very low by historical standards. Americans are, I think, have optimism encoded in their DNA. And it's very difficult to put the damper on American optimism, but recent years, at least temporarily, have done that. Americans are less confident in our ability to surmount the biggest challenges that we face. Once again, these tend to be transient sentiments, and I am plenty old enough to remember how we were feeling as a country in the mid and late 1970s in the wake of the Vietnam War and as stagflation took hold. But still, I think since then, we haven't been in this kind of funk. And finally, there is, I think, a real turning inward. And I think it's especially relevant for me to underscore this point in this particular place, in this audience. No one should underestimate the toll that 12 years of war have taken on the American psyche, especially because the American people are increasingly disposed to believe that it hasn't been worth it. I don't want to judge the accuracy of those sentiments, but they are very widespread and they are growing stronger, not weaker. And I have to say that as things seem to be becoming unstuck in Iraq with a return to pitched sectarian warfare, those sentiments are not likely to abate. We can have a debate about what's going on, and I suspect Bob Lieber and I might, but the public reaction to those events is a fact, and it's a fact that has to be taken into account. Okay, I'm wending my way towards my conclusion. Why does any of this matter? I think two reasons overwhelmingly. First, whether we like it or not, we stepped into the place of the British Empire a long time ago, and the world is better off for it. And I guess it's especially appropriate to say in this setting that were it not for our role as the guarantor of the freedom of the high seas, you'd see a lot more Somalian pirates in this world, and they wouldn't be confined, to the 100 or 150 miles off the eastern coast of Africa. Right? You'd have a really big problem in the world that would affect not only security, but also the flow of commerce. Right? We are, whether we like it or not, we're in the business of providing what Michael Mandelbaum in a book called global public goods. And if we don't do it, I very much suspect that nobody else will. Others would love to step into the breach, but if they do, they won't use their power the way we're using ours. And secondly, and now I take off one hat and put on another. I'm a member of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. And you can like or dislike or be somewhere in the middle on the famous Bush freedom agenda or Ronald Reagan's democracy agenda, but the fact of the matter is that democracy around the world would be much weaker if it weren't for the fact that with regard to both freedom and democracy, the United States has been outward-looking and forward-leaning for quite some time. And if we turn inward, there is no reason to believe that the great democratic tide is going to remain high. it is likely to ebb. If we lose confidence in our own democracy, other people are going to lose confidence in the prospects for democracy in their own countries and in their own regions. I could go on, but those are two of many reasons why how we deal with our internal problems matters. Okay, in conclusion, what do we need to do? And I phrase the question that way because it's what we need to do. There is no deus ex machina, right? There is no political equivalent of the Federal Reserve Board that without public authorization can act to save us from ourselves. Our country does not work that way. If we are in trouble, only we can get out of that trouble. So, what do we need to do? Well, first of all, we need a form of political leadership in this country that is willing to do two things. Number one, acknowledge what has been all too rare in recent years, that, we are all, in the end, citizens of one country, and the idea that the country can do well if the two major parties are straining in polar opposite directions. I mean, anybody who's studied a parallelogram of forces knows that that is a prescription for inaction, right? If you have equal forces pulling in opposite directions, what kind of motion do you get out of that? But that's what we've been doing. We've been tying ourselves up in knots. We've been tying ourselves up in knots because each one of the mules pulling the rope, or elephants pulling the rope, if you prefer, has had a sense that its direction is much more important than the collective direction of the country. So we need leaders who are prepared to think somewhat differently about the relationship between partisanship and citizenship. And secondly, we need leaders who are willing to join hands and stare together into the television cameras and tell the American people where we are and what we need to do if we want to get to where we want to go. It has been a very long time since that has happened. And usually one party or one set of leaders hangs back, waiting for the other set of leaders to utter an unpleasant truth, at which point they whack them. That's not much of an incentive to tell the truth. So those are two things that we need out of our leaders. And what do we need out of ourselves as citizens? Well, we have to decide what kind of country we want to live in, with what kind of prospects and what kind of role in the world. Nobody can do that for us. We are on a track to not only a diminished role in the world, but also a diminished future here at home. That's a fact. And that's what those figures that I read from the president's budget, it's not his fault, that's everybody's budget. You look at Paul Ryan's budget, you won't see anything better, I can assure you. We have to decide whether that's where we want to be. And it's not just public spending, it's also how we spend our own money. Flat screen TVs or higher education. 1,800 square foot house and a better life for our kids, or 2,500 or 2,800 square feet, and maybe they'll have to take out college loans that will be so large that they'll be discouraged from going down that road. I mean, these are real choices. So that's where we are in my judgment. That's why it matters. I've ended on the question of leadership and citizenship because at the end, the choices that we make as a country are determined by our own sense of what's appropriate and necessary, what the ethical requirements of leadership and citizenship are. And right now, I'm afraid we're off on the wrong track in both of those areas, and it's going to require a lot of work to get back on track. The only thing that encourages me is that everybody in the past 200 some odd years who's bet against the United States of America has gone broke. Thank you very much, and I'm eager to take your questions.
Okay, time for questions. Roll out.
Mark Cook,
thinking back to the Johnson administration in terms of getting legislation through the Congress. And Johnson was obviously willing to twist arms and break bows to get things through the Congress. Nixon was able to do that to some degree as well. To what extent is this a failure of presidential leadership to be aggressive enough in pushing this? Is it possible that Obama, if he were putting more pressure on elected officials on both parties? For example, there was an example in the New York Times the other day about an Alaska senator who wanted somebody from the administration to come up and say something to her constituency, and then they voted against the gun restriction bill. And the point of the article was that in the good old days they would have lost their trip to Alaska out of that deal if you didn't go along with what we're trying to go, but they're still going. In other words, is the administration being firm enough, or would it make a difference?
Well, that's a popular question in Washington, which is not to say it's a bad question. And here's my view. I think there's something to the idea that this president doesn't have a lot of experience in Congress or negotiating with Congress. I think that's true, and that he has probably failed to do some things that he would have benefited from doing, and we would have as well. On the other hand, if you look back to the Johnson administration, there are two fundamentally different structural facts then versus now. First of all, in the years where Johnson enjoyed his greatest legislative success, 65, 66, he had not just a majority, but a supermajority of members of his own party in the House and the Senate. So almost all of the arms that he was twisting were arms belonging to members of his own party. That's number one. And number two, there was a lot less polarization back then than there is now. The gaps between the two political parties weren't as great. And so a president, a Democratic president like Johnson would have some language and beliefs in common with half the Republican Party. And a Republican president like Nixon had some language and beliefs and policy preferences in common with half the Democratic Party. That's just not true anymore. So there are fewer arms to twist, and twisting them may be less productive than it used to be. And I'm inclined to think that the name of the game is less twisting arms and more a willingness to consider the kinds of compromises across party lines that are conspicuous by their absence right now. I think rather than twisting arms, you have to give all parties to the discussion enough so that they don't come away thinking that it's been, it's been a big win for some people and a huge loss for them. So that's sort of what I think about this.
Yeah. Frank Bellman, Office of the Secretary of Defense. You mentioned that bipartisanship has not been this severe since the late 1800s. What brought the parties to overlap again after that division at that time? Are there any similarities to what we have today? Can you see any parallels?
Well, it's a wonderful historical question, and stripped to its essentials, the divisions between the two parties that began in the 1880s and really came to dominate the 1890s were divisions between two very different forms of economic and social organization. So by 1896, you had a race between a rural populist on the one hand and on the other a representative of rising urban industrial capitalism. And and McKinley won a clean victory and repeated it 4 years later because, in fact, he represented the rising tide. He represented the future, and Bryan stood for the past when you got right down to it. And the American people came to understand that. They came to understand it all too well. The Democrats in the 1920s and gave the Republicans basically no fight at all. Right? The forces that had won in 1896 so dominated the political system in the decade after the end of the First World War that we didn't have the kind of dialogue about what industrial capitalism needed to do next. And so it was the failure of the dominant Republican Party to take that next step, to confront that question, to take a look at what was happening to the distribution of income and wealth and ask itself hard questions about who was going to buy all of these products that American factories were churning out, That's one of the things that contributed to the collapse in 1929 and the Great Depression. And once again, a change in dominant parties. All of which is to say that as of right now, it's not clear who's rising and who's falling. I can talk about some trends, but we have not yet had reached the kind of inflection point where you can say that one party is the sun and the other party is the moon. We are not only deeply divided, we're closely divided. And under those circumstances, I don't know how to predict what the next turn of the wheel is going to be. All I can say is that if you look back at the long cycles of American history, you do see periods of division interspersed between, though sometimes very long interruptions, between periods of unified party dominance around a single dominant understanding of what the country is and where it needs to go.
Reed Bondar from Mercury Academy. Two maybe possible solutions. I haven't, the name Jürgen Habermas hasn't left into my mind for a long time, but I mean, is there any way to get people to agree to certain kinds of standards to engage in an ideologically cleansed discussion of these things on both sides? That's number one. Number two, maybe things off your answer to the last question, which is, it does seem to me that the younger generation is a little bit freer of these ideological divisions and maybe also of the stupid materialism of some of their elders, thinking of my own sons anyway. Yeah, I mean, is that a trend? Is that a good trend? Should we just put them in charge or wait for them to get in charge? Obviously, that's not a real solution. But do you think things will get better when maybe the teens, the 20-somethings of today are making more decisions? Is that a good trend? Is it perceivable at all?
Well, you know, as the father of a 28-year-old, I guess I can say I'm glad you asked that question. I will also confess that I would not have predicted that the name Jürgen Habermas would come up if I didn't raise it. To take your questions in reverse order, you know, I've been looking very closely at the new, this new generation, usually called for short the millennials. And you're absolutely right to say that they are something different. And one thing we can say for sure is that their attitudes on social and cultural issues are fundamentally different, right? And they don't understand what their parents and grandparents are fighting about. They just don't. I mean, I can tell you that for my son's generation, I don't know what anybody in this room believes about this, the same-sex marriage fight, this high decibel fight, is almost incomprehensible. Their answer to it is a shrug. What's the problem? Yeah, let them get married, for heaven's sake, right? And similarly, their attitudes on ethnic and racial differences, very different. They have grown up in the wake of the historic decision we made in 1965 to reopen the gates of immigration after 40 years of having them slammed shut. 40 years in which immigrants as a percentage of our population declined by 2/3, from 15% to 5%. That 5% figure that we reached in the mid-1960s is the lowest figure ever recorded since the founding of the Republic. And then we turned that around. And we're just about back up to 15% again, but it's 15% from places that we've never received large numbers of immigrants from before. And when I remember dropping our son off in his freshman dormitory at NYU about a decade ago, I looked around and said, holy cow, right? That was a real education. You know, 1/3 of them were from East Asia, and 1/3 of them were from the Indian subcontinent, and 1/3 of them were the kids of native-born parents, roughly speaking. I said to myself, this is the bow of something big, and it has been the bow of something big, and so this is going to be the most racially and ethnically tolerant group of young Americans in our history. It is also, by the way, an increasingly religiously disengaged generation. The percentage of young adults who say that they're religiously unaffiliated is phenomenally higher than it was for their parents and grandparents. So the rise of the religious right was the big story of the 1980s and the 1990s. The rise of religious skepticism and diminished religious affiliation is the big story of now. Now, what does this mean about the problems that we face? Does this mean that millennials have put quote unquote stupid materialism behind them? Your phrase. Maybe, but I think they're trying to replace it with smart materialism. And I'm not just saying this because my son is about to graduate from the University of Chicago Business School and become a venture capitalist, but because as a father, I think I've observed something about the generation, and this is not a Gandhi-esque generation that is interested in taking a vow of poverty. They'd like to earn a lot of money and have a heck of a good time doing it. I think many of them are doomed to disappointment, but be that as it may, they're not eager to put on the hair shirt. But they do have a different sense, and it is for this generation that the Facebooks and the Googles have become iconic, right? Because it's not only the kind of service that they can relate to very directly and viscerally, but it's also produced by people who look like them and think like them in a workplace that is their model of how the American private sector ought to be organized. So, stupid materialism, not to altruism, but to smart materialism. Now, what that means, here's the nut of the question. What does that mean about their capacity to work together to solve public problems? Basically, what I've talked about so far is a kind of quasi-libertarian turn in the psyche of the youngest generation. And to the extent that there is a collective dimension to it, it is a voluntary collective dimension. They have not grown up in happy times for public institutions or for American government. And they, many of them want things from that government, but they don't like it, they don't trust it, and they don't want to join it. Yes, sir. Sorry to dispel your illusions, but some of us are decent people.
Yeah. I've heard it now all morning and again this afternoon of the stalemate in government. Would the creation of a viable third party be a likely answer or possible answer? I don't need to replace either of the two biggest parties, but rather as the tiebreaker for more reasonable solutions more frequently.
I've been in 6 presidential campaigns. My first was as the speechwriter for John Anderson in 1980. And that was my hope 33 years ago. It's no longer my hope. I have come to believe that the basic structure of the American constitutional system does not make room for a quote-unquote viable third party. You either replace one of the two parties or you die. Now, sometimes when you die, it's the way a bee dies after it stings you, right? Leaves something behind. And many third parties in our history have left important things behind. I will not soon forget the election of 1992 in which I participated. There's no question about the fact that Ross Perot's candidacy, if someone who is probably crazy got 19% of the vote, because he talked intelligently about something that people cared about, namely the budget deficit, if that could, if he could get 19% of the vote, that is sort of a silver bullet explanation as to why Bill Clinton, faced with the choice between austerity and public investment in his first budget, chose fiscal restraint. In the famous battle between Bob Rubin and Bob Reich, he made a clean decision for Bob Rubin. He stuck with it, even though members of his own party didn't like it. So third parties can have an influence on the two-party system. But there is no such thing in my judgment as a quote-unquote viable third party that has even as much power in our system as the modest amount of power that the liberal Democrats do in the United Kingdom. Our system is structured to disadvantage third parties. Huge number of questions over here.
I've had a couple.
Oh, okay. I'll let you do the recognizing.
Yeah, George.
All right. George Lucas, Davis Academy Bill. Good to see you back here. Thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
When you were here before, this ties in with a comment you made earlier about the next generation being a voluntary, libertarian kind of community. You yourself, some years back, were advocating a return to conscription or some kind of national service as a way of overcoming some of the social division you continue to worry about. And I wonder if that's still a good idea in your mind now, at least to have some kind of commitment on the part of all of us to serve the country, not necessarily military.
Look, I haven't changed my mind about the merits of the idea. I have to say, having worked the idea for the better part of 2 decades, I'm a little bit discouraged about the lack of uptake in the body politic. And I will have to say that in military ranks, my proposal has been greeted with something less than open arms. I understand why. I mean, I was in the military during the Vietnam era. I guess I want to pose the question, as to how long we're going to be able to afford the manpower costs that we now have, consistent with having the size military that we have to have. Right? Especially, I mean, if you look at the benefits side, which appears to me to be jealously guarded politically, right? I mean, I spend a certain amount of time listening to people like Michel Flournoy, who I understand was here earlier today, but smart defense analysts and Brookings like Mike O'Hanlon, they're all worried about the same thing, that the tail is devouring the head. And I don't have a magic solution for that question, but it's not clear to me that we're on a sustainable track. If military health care costs keep on going up, if military pensions keep on going up at the present rate, if it costs upwards of $1 million to keep a single soldier on the field for a year in Afghanistan, a figure I've heard, how much of this can we do? I don't know. There are people in this room who've spent a lot more time studying that question than I have, but I'm worried. I'm worried as a citizen that we've made some decisions that seemed like great decisions at the time and have worked out pretty well, but are now hitting a wall. That's my fear.
I think we have time for at least one more.
Very briefly. Coming in from Europe, I think it's very interesting to observe the inequalities that you talked about, which have really risen over the last 20 to 30 years. And it seems to be different from what was the vision of the founding fathers, that you didn't want to have really great concentrations of conspicuous wealth in a few families. Now I wonder, how did this happen? Where did this happen with the enormous rise, for instance, in executive remuneration and these sorts of things that seem almost perverse? How did that come to be part of the American psyche and ethos in the way it has?
Well, I don't want to be glib about this, but I think globalization has a lot to do with it, right? And the Cornell economist Robert Frank wrote a very good book a few years ago called The Winner-Take-All Society, in which he pointed out that in virtually every profession, the very top was breaking away from the rest. It's true in sports, it's true in business, it's true, unfortunately, in academia, where there are a handful of superstars that negotiate for shockingly high salaries. And it's because the scope for the display of their excellence is now global. And that generates, look at basketball, for heaven's sake, right? It's become a global sport, and some of the salaries that the Michael Jordans and Kobe Bryants, et cetera, of this world can command are a function of the fact that there's a global market for the product. And the other consequence of globalization is that businesses are less geographically located and tethered than they once were. If you're in Flint, Michigan, or if you're Kellogg's in Battle Creek, Michigan, you're in a place, you're part of that community, you are embedded in that social structure. People know who you are and what you're doing and what you're earning, right? And there is a kind of a social accountability that grows up when you are embedded in a place. If you are, to use a phrase with an unfortunate history, a rootless cosmopolitan, which many of our business leaders are, well then you are going to be much more embedded in the global social network of people like you, earning what you're earning, or maybe more, in which case you envy them and go back home and pressure your boards to raise your salary to equal theirs, etc. So that's not the end of the explanation, but I think globalization combined with this winner-take-all structure is the beginning of the explanation.
Okay, well, just one last one. Your social division
Yeah.
that you talked about. Now it's 7%, 93%. Other than demonizing those to some extent who have done well, almost as if they've done well illegally, whether they've done well illegally.
I didn't say that,
No,
did I?
you didn't. I mean, not you, but I mean that's sort of the drumbeat that floats outside. If you're wealthy and if you've done well, fine. If we restructure, we've talked about restructuring the tax code, sort of balancing things out. How do you keep that divide from growing when folks who don't get high school educations continue to, as you talked about, unwed mothers, children born out of wedlock? How does that morass? Well, I mean, what is a way to get after that in society to close that gap, which isn't healthy. I agree with what you said, and I'm not saying that you said any of the other things that I sort of articulated, because you did, but it's just kind of bouncing out there, and it seems to be fracturing more, the haves and the have-nots versus a coming together with, okay, how do we solve this gap and bring things closer together? So do you have any thoughts on how you solve one of your three points?
I have too many thoughts and not enough time. But I'm not going to be glib. I'm going to try to answer your question, but I'm going to answer it more briefly than it deserves. Okay? I began in life as a political theorist. And one of the first theorists I fell in love with was Aristotle. And one of the first things that I learned from Aristotle is that stable, decent constitutional government depends on a large, self-confident middle class. The problem that we're facing now is not the problem that we've faced for a couple of generations, namely the gap between the top and the bottom. The problem is the gap between the top and the middle, and the fact that the middle is not expanding, it's shrinking. Its incomes are not rising, they're falling. Its self-confidence is not high, it's low and shrinking. That's the problem. And so, yes, I'm on a board of an organization called the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unwanted Pregnancy. And we've been working on this problem of teen pregnancy. The rate has fallen, believe it or not, 52% in the past 15 years. That's the good news. The bad news is that unwed pregnancy has now moved up the age scale, and it's women in their 20s, not in their teens. That's a change of sorts, because it makes it somewhat more likely that they'll at least get a high school diploma. But it's still a big problem. The real problem is with the middle class. And if I ask myself what can be done about that through public policy, well, I will confess that some of it does begin with the tax code. And, my wife and I are college professors. And you know what? We suddenly woke up to realize that puts us in the top 2%. Go figure. Okay? And what you notice as a member of the top 2% is that there is a big difference between the taxes that you pay on different categories of income. And the kinds of income that ordinary middle-class families rely on almost 100% are taxed at a very high rate. The sort of income that puts my wife and me in the top 2%, having to do with dividends and capital gains, taxed at a much lower rate. Query, why is that? Is society getting out of that differential what it hopes to? And if not, maybe we ought to think about doing something about it. And this is, I don't want to soak the rich. I just don't want to immiserate the middle class. There's a big difference. And right now, the taxes that the middle class pays are high, and when you add them all up, rising. Because it's an optical illusion to look at just what's happening at the federal level. You also have to look at payroll taxes, you have to look at state taxes, you have to look at local taxes. Many middle-class families in states like California are paying 55% on their marginal dollars. I think this is crazy, right? And they're paying 55% on their ordinary earned income because many of us are paying 15% on dividends and 20% on capital gains. I just think we have to think about that. Not from a populist standpoint, but from the standpoint of our economy and the cohesion of our society. Now, final point. In the long run, government that's doing its job cannot substitute for a market that isn't doing its job. Unless we can generate a situation in which the market earned incomes of middle-class families stop falling and start rising again, we have a problem that won't quit. The great analytical challenge that confronts the economics profession, of which I'm not a member, and also the great political question that confronts our society, is whether in an era of globalization with millions of new people brought into the free market system, whether we can find a way of adding enough value as a society so that people in the middle class, not the highly educated professionals, but people in that middle stratum of education and skills can earn a decent wage that has some prospects of rising over time. Right now, the signs are not encouraging. But if we don't crack that problem, I think everything else that we get right will be swamped by what we haven't done. And with that, I guess the time is up.
Okay, well, on behalf of... I think you brought it home at the end on the ethical dimension here of a very wicked national challenge. But this is a compass from the Stockdale Center. We like to call it a moral compass. I don't think you need one, but it sure would be nice to have one on your desk and you get people and you can influence them. If they're starting to be selfish instead of selfless, come look at the compass. But thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I know only one quotation from Admiral Stockdale, but I will not repeat it here.
All right.